Good evening, Kingston Civic Receptors. My name is Martin McQuillan. I am the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation on this evening of research. It is my great privilege to introduce to you one of the true stars of Kingston University on an evening when the university is particularly interested in demonstrating the ways in which our research connects with the real world, the outside world, beyond the walls of the university. I'm able to introduce to you tonight our Professor of Journalism, Professor Brian Cathcart. Brian Cathcart is a name that many of you may recognise from the work that he has done. He has for many years been a distinguished journalist and has produced groundbreaking work on, for example, the Stephen Lawrence case and on the inquiry into Deep Cut Barracks. And most notably, and perhaps more recently, his work in the inquiry into phone hacking and his work with Hacked Off and his contribution to the legislation that then became the inquiry into standards in the press. Brian is also the author of numerous books, including my favourite book by Brian entitled Were You Up for Patillo, which is a book from 1997, which is how I first knew Brian, even before I came to Kingston University. Tonight he is going to talk about the need for experts in the review of the press. This is a country that needs experts, and Brian is definitely one of those. It's a great privilege to welcome Brian Cathcart. Brian.
Thank you, Martin, and good evening, everybody. I'm going to start with a confession. I don't think I've confessed this in public before in any kind of formal way, but you're looking at a rather odd beast. I am a university professor who has no postgraduate qualification. I don't have a PhD. My wife teases me. She's got an MBA. And I have never written, Martin probably doesn't know this, I have never written an article for a peer-reviewed journal. Okay? I think you may be blushing there. And I kind of want to explain to you why I am where I am and why I'm doing what I'm doing, and why I find Kingston a great place to be doing it as well. And I start with a little story, which is a few months ago I found myself invited to one of those events where you have to wear a DJ, and of course every gentleman in the room will be familiar with this. When I got everything together, I couldn't find any cufflinks. So I literally ran out into the road and up the street to see if I could find some cufflinks in a shop. And I went up and down the high street and none. And on the way back, kind of in despair, I called into a novelty shop. And in the novelty shop, I found what appeared to be the only cufflinks on sale in Muswell Hill. And they were a pair, and one of them, I should have brought them. One of them said, "Trust me." And the other said, "I'm a journalist." Now, it is funny, but it is very depressing in another sense if you're teaching journalism, that basically trust in our profession is a novelty joke. And that's really what I'm doing here, trying to tackle that. A question for you. About 4 weeks ago, the European Broadcasting Union produced an annual report on trust in media across Europe. For the UK audience, the headline finding related to trust in written press. The survey covered 33 countries, including Turkey, Greece, Serbia, Macedonia. The UK came last out of 33 by a long stretch. Trust in the media in this country. The graph went like that for the UK. Trust in the media, they subtract the distrust from the trust or whatever it was, and you get a score of -51 for the UK. The average for the EU was about -1. I mean, just extraordinary. Now, the question I have for you is, how many people in the room knew about that study? Did you read about it in the national press? Funny that, isn't it? Now, again, funny, but it's not. This is one of the kind of things I struggle with in my own profession. And, you know, you've heard, I was a journalist. I still consider myself a journalist, but I was certainly a working journalist for 30 years. One of the things I struggle with is to persuade other journalists to understand that if journalists have a mission to hold power to account, if it's their business to shine lights in dark places, it's even more a mission for journalists to shine lights in the dark places of their own profession. If they're not going to do it, who is? And the truth is, it's people like me. I mean, me and a lot of other people. I should stress that there are people like me working in, well, virtually all the universities that teach journalism have people beavering away at the kind of issues that I address. But there's a kind of pool of expertise now outside the industry that is scrutinizing the industry that never existed before. The best illustration of that is the story of the Cathcart reports. I don't know if you remember the Cathcart reports, but in 1990, there was a crisis just like the kind of Leveson crisis. There was an investigation not like the Leveson crisis because it took place entirely behind closed doors and was the property of lawyers, journalists, and politicians. Nobody else was involved. Victims, not involved at all. But this was at the time of Hillsborough, of the Russell Harty case, of the case of Gordon Kay, I don't know if you remember, the journalist, he was in a terrible road accident. Journalists actually got into his hotel room and took photographs of him in his hospital bed. Horrible stories. This was a crisis. It was investigated. Recommendations were made. And a kind of fail-safe was built in that there would be a follow-up report by the same lawyer to look into it to establish that whether the press had done the right things. Recommendations were made. The press carried out some recommendations. 2 years later, Cathcart went back again, looked at it, and said, no, this is completely inadequate. This is not at all what we recommended. And it died because there was no external scrutiny. There were small groups of people, interested parties, but there was no external scrutiny. The journalism profession, for whatever reason, and there are lots of reasons, journalism profession was quite content to let the idea of decent accountability, of independent, effective regulation slip away out of the public radar so that they went on in the return to the world they were used to of puppet regulation, essentially. And that's how we got to where we are. So the kind of business of having people investigate this, the business of having people scrutinize this, is pretty new. At that stage, there were not many universities teaching journalism. Now, there are dozens. And it's, for my money, important work. It's kind of unavoidable work because if you're teaching journalism, you can't not engage with the students with this stuff. You can't not. The students are no fools. They see things going on and they say, what's being done about this? And you have to engage. You have to be able to explain it. And if you're going to explain something to students, you really need to understand it. And I'll give you one little illustration of some of the kind of understanding that needs to be done, because not only are we up against an industry that is, as it were, absolutely refusing to investigate its own problems, but quite a substantial part of the industry is standing with a megaphone, shouting at the public messages of its own choice, serving its own interests, with the effect that it's almost impossible to conduct an argument around them. It's like being at a dinner party with somebody with a megaphone. It's just, they're drowning everything out. So a good example of that is something called Section 40. Now, Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act 2013 is very close to my heart. I am a serious geek on this stuff, okay? I was kind of involved when this stuff was written. I was involved with the politicians when it was all being agreed on. We were, having late night meetings and all that kind of stuff, getting this stuff done. What does Section 40 do? Well, let me start at the other end. 4 weeks ago, Theresa May announced in her manifesto that she was going to repeal Section 40. This was part of a shameless bargain. Again, it's not something you'll have read about. It's part of a shameless bargain with the press. And the bargain was that, in exchange for their wholehearted support, particularly the wholehearted support of the Daily Mail, and they got it, by gum she got it, 13 pages of attacks on Jeremy Corbyn on the day before polling. In exchange for that kind of stuff, she was going to scrap a measure, Section 40, which delivered two things. One was it delivered affordable access to justice. That's affordable for ordinary people as opposed to millionaires in cases of libel and breach of privacy. It did that by creating a regime in which there would be low-cost arbitration. So we're talking about somebody like you or me being able to go to take a newspaper to court, as it were, to an arbitrator, for something in the region of £100, £200, as opposed to £100,000 or £200,000. Yeah. Tied in with that was a nudge to push the press towards more effective independent regulation. Not state regulation, independent regulation, but more effective. So the two things were hooked together. How did the press present this? They presented this as an attack on press freedom, as everything is in their world that they don't like. An attack on press freedom founded on, which entailed arrangements whereby newspapers which won libel actions in court would have to pay all the costs of the person who sued them. Now that sounds appalling, doesn't it? It's disgraceful. Well, the part of the story they didn't tell is that that could only happen if they forced that person, the person suing them, to go to court, £200,000, rather than to the arbitrator, £200. Only on those circumstances would they have to pay that full bill. So this, a kind of completely false picture of what Section 40 involved was presented to the public, and when I say presented to the public, there was a public consultation, obligingly created by Theresa May's Culture Secretary on Section 40, and it was fought, as it were, in public by the press on the basis that it was this appalling assault on press freedom and a kind of travesty of justice in costs. A completely upside-down vision, but again, keep in your mind the picture of the megaphone. They're able to bellow this stuff out day after day, and they did. Every single national newspaper ran a campaign on this. Not only that, every single regional newspaper ran a campaign on it, and they encouraged their readers to put pressure on their local MPs to resist Section 40 on the grounds that it was an assault on press freedom. Those are the weapons they have. It's a big megaphone. They got thousands and thousands of people to write in on this issue. A completely unbalanced agenda, a completely unbalanced picture presented to them. Now, you come back to the stuff that I do and the stuff that people like me in other universities up and down the country are doing. We scrutinize this stuff, we understand Section 40, we get the message out, we brief politicians. That's really important. Briefing politicians of all parties. Hacked Off, which I was one of the founders of, Hacked Off is a completely non-party organisation. I have sat with MPs of all parties, MPs with opinions so far removed from my own that it's kind of surreal, and sat with them and briefed them on these press issues. And it's interesting. You get this stuff at the top. The leader, and Tony Blair did the same stuff. So I'm non-party in those terms. The leader does the deals, does the nod and the wink with the editor or the proprietor. But the MPs are pretty good on these issues when they're brave enough. So just before Theresa May announced her decision to repeal Section 40, obligingly for Rupert Murdoch and Paul Dacre, just weeks before that, the Parliamentary Select Committee on the Media, briefed by people like me, Parliamentary Select Committee on the Media, unanimously reported that Section 40 should go ahead. So the work can be done. You have to beaver away. The briefing can be done. The research has to be done. You have to understand this. I mean, the Leveson report is, you will remember, 4 very thick volumes. It's the kind of starting point for all this. And there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, I could go on the various fronts you can engage. These newspapers are, I have to say it, very dishonest. You hardly turn over a stone before you find things that they're lying about. So there's an awful lot of work to be done, an awful lot of kind of articles to be written. As I say, I don't really have the time for the peer-reviewed process. But churning and churning work on this kind of stuff. And it is, it's great, to be able to share that with students. It's great to be able to think that here we are, and we engage with victims of press abuse as well, and get them involved, get them out in public so that people understand what's been happening. It's great to be able to do that and think this has never happened before, and to be able to challenge them on that level. Of course, it's kind of David and Goliath stuff. We don't have a megaphone, but it kind of works, I think. Certainly, I feel more positive now, I have to say, than I did a week ago when it looked like Theresa May was going to win, and whatever party you're from, you support. I was quite clear her winning was going to be a very, very bad thing for press reform. So things are looking a bit better now, certainly, but there's still enormous amounts of work to be done. I'm conscious that I'm talking about a subject on which absolutely everybody has a strong opinion. So I will stop there and ask you if you have any questions. Yes?
Thank you. That was extremely depressing, but
it's not meant to be. It's not meant to be.
We need to hear these things. I'm a big fan of organisations like Full Fact and All Sides, which during the recent election have been really useful at putting out their researched and unbiased facts to help people make decisions. But I'm wondering whether you think there's a role, or a potential role, for organisations like that to develop into mainstream fact-based press, and if so, why doesn't somebody do it?
Right. Now, I don't know how many people know Full Fact, which I know quite well, which is a fact-checking organisation. It's a charity. It's not a big outfit. I mean, it's 7 or 8 people, I think, at the last count. They are able to raise money for big projects like fact-checking a general election, but they struggle. But what they do is incredibly rigorous and thorough, and I have never seen them faltered. They are extremely careful. They're not journalists in the sense that they're not writing stories, investigating stuff. What they're doing is trying to establish whether the claim made in this newspaper headline or the claim made, for example, on BBC Question Time by this politician is accurate or not. Now, I'm absolutely clear that there's some, and it's big in the United States now as well, that there's a huge future for this kind of activity, and it would probably be, huge and funded by the likes of Google and Facebook, because they need fact checkers and they need that kind of stuff. I mean, you know, fake news adds whole new dimensions to what I've been talking about, and I'll just throw in a line, if you forgive me, throw in a line for that kind of connects them. One of the things that the national newspapers have tried to do is to say, a kind of look over there thing, you know, the kind of look over there thing. Fake news, terrible. This is dreadful. Somebody should be doing that. Somebody should be getting on the case of Google and Facebook and making them gag these people or whatever it is they want them to do. And you think, well, I've been living with fake news for a long time. We all have. BuzzFeed ran a lovely story about 2 months ago saying the reason that Britain doesn't have a big fake news industry is because it's got a national press that does the job. And you know, this look over there, it's all stuff on the internet. Woo, 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 woo. It's not like that. Fake news is about accuracy. The same as newspapers are like accuracy. When the Select Committee chairman announced he was going to conduct an investigation into fake news, he was inundated with people saying, okay, let's start with the papers. They're the worst offenders. And you know, I kind of make a joke about this. I now, wherever I go, I ask this question, so I'll ask it here. Mr. Putin interferes in elections in the United States. He interferes in elections in France. Why don't we get any evidence of interfering in elections here? What are we to deduce from that? I don't have an answer to this. I just think it's an interesting conundrum. Why don't we have a lot of evidence of him meddling with UK elections? Are we to understand he's happy with the way things are? Could that be? Does he feel like BuzzFeed, that somebody else is already doing the job he would be doing? I merely throw those out there. You'll have your own ideas. Sorry?
So the American president's slightly more powerful.
Perhaps, yes. I mean, he did meddle in the French elections quite spectacularly. I don't know. Yeah, sure.
So very topically, because here at Kingston University, but you know, if there's one positive that came out last week, it was the fact that there were a lot of students that voted allegedly, which is great. And I'm sure quite a lot of us around here have seen quite a lot of the interviews with students on TV recently. And it's just fascinating in the sense that you're talking a lot about press, but is there a line between press and social media? Because quite a lot of the students saying, newspapers? Some newspapers?
Yeah.
I rely on Twitter. So hang on. So is Twitter press? Is Twitter reliable? Is it factual?
Yeah.
Is there so how do we interpret that?
Well, I think, in the last 3 years of teaching journalism here, I think I've come across one student who reads newspapers, actual newspapers. We've got to accept that's history. And I think it's a really important element of understanding, for example, Leveson, is that his model is not about dead trees. It's not about old newspapers. His model of regulation is specifically not newspapers, but news publishers. And it's defined in, among other things, the Crime and Courts Act, Section 30, as essentially people who pay people to produce news, organisations that pay people to pay journalists. It's slightly more complicated than that, but that's the basis of it. I, certainly in teaching, try not to distinguish between different platforms for the information, because you're teaching them to write. We get them in, and you're kind of teaching them to. The first thing you do is teach them. You tell them, look, you don't know how to write. You may have written essays at school, and a lot of them come thinking I'm good at writing. So, and then you say, well, try and write a news story like this, and it all seems upside down, wrong way around to them. And count the words. Never counted words before. Count the words because you've got too many, and they're always. Writing essays, they're always trying to stretch them out. I have this Everest thing, they're always trying to add a few more words. But with journalism, it's all about trying to be compact, ideally trying to be compact. And all of that you teach them and it changes their view. And it's about, that's just text. And that text can be crunched up in little bits of social media, or chopped up in little bits of social media, or it can be on a blog, or it can be on a news website, it can be broadcast, it can be on print. I encourage them to think of media and as content as content, and try and separate this. Of course, we understand and we teach them, and I do research in the field about the ways in which the different media alter the messages as they transmit them. But I still think, especially when you're talking about accuracy, which is the kind of core, I think, of a lot of the regulation issues, accuracy is accuracy. It's, it's the stuff that full fact give you. It's trying to be right. That old common definition of journalism is that it's the closest approximation of the truth that you can manage in the available time. That is, that's what you're striving for, and that's, that's the same on any medium, for me. Yes, sir.
How have we got to this position? If we've got the written press that comes from all different political persuasions, how come they're 100% behind as you were mentioning, removing Article 40? How come they're not fighting within themselves to say, this is the shield of...
Yeah, the Crusader, yes. Well, I think this is one of the kind of paradoxes and one of the kind of con tricks of the industry, is that they tell you that they're fierce rivals and, scrapping over every story and all that sort of thing. But in practice, not only do they not shop each other when they do things wrong, and it's worth recalling, the most flagrant example of this, there are lots of kind of perfectly recent examples, but the most flagrant one was on the morning after The Guardian revealed the fact that Millie Dowler's phone had been hacked by the News of the World. Not one of the tabloid press put the story on the front page. So it had been lead item on all the TV news stations the night before, and they were trying to bury it inside. Not only are they not, but they're trying to cover everything up. It's a cartel, it's a little club. The political differences between them don't seem to make much difference. The Daily Mirror is just as happy in that family as the Sun or the Express. The kind of Daily Mirror's politics, it's a pathetically run down newspaper now, but its politics are kind of just for show for the public. As far as the corporation is concerned, it moves in lockstep with all the others. There's no kind of commercial rivalry between them. Partly, they're all locked into one organisation that sells their advertising for them. What's it called, News Power or something like that. And The Guardian is in the same group. It's been a cause of despair to me that The Guardian would not, having broken that story. Nick Davis, the great reporter who broke the story who unearthed the phone hacking scandal, and who stayed with the case for years afterwards and is an ardent supporter of the Leveson reforms. Nick Davis has now retired, a well-earned retirement, quite a lot of which he seems to spend in Argentina. He's out of the picture. Nobody at the Guardian has picked up the case. They have dropped it. And I don't know whether it's their commercial weakness, because they're in a lot of trouble at the moment, or whether it's some sort of sense of solidarity, but they no longer fight the fight. They never joined a proper regulator. They never really got behind the Leveson solutions, which they had helped to precipitate. It's a cause of great disappointment to me. But this industry, I remember the first time I met a government minister lobbying on this issue. I don't think I can say who it is. He said, Brian, you've got to realise you're dealing with a branch of the mafia. Every year that's gone by seems to confirm that. Yes?
But surely the situation's been the same since the 30s, where you had Rothermere, Harmsworth, Beaverbrook, all a cabal, and all hand in glove in the House of Lords, in the Ivy, and wherever, and they all ran it as private patronage.
I agree. I don't ever try to suggest that it's kind of so much worse now than it was. I think there are senses in which it is considerably worse than it was. But on the whole, I don't think anybody's qualified to make that judgment. What I would say is that public expectation has risen. I think that we expect the corporations that operate in this country and make money out of our trade to behave responsibly, legally even. I think we are less tolerant of some of the hypocrisies that have been going on. And I think, in particular, we expect the rights of citizens to be respected. And that is probably the strongest new element in all of this, is that we are a rights society now.
Surely the facts don't entirely agree with you in that the published press, the print press, is effectively dying on its feet. I can remember going back to the 50s and 60s, you had 3 newspapers on the Saturday afternoon reporting the football. You don't now. The Standard is now a free magazine, for what it's worth. Newspaper circulation is a fraction of what it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not sure how I'm contradicting myself, but I mean, I look at those figures and I see evidence of a lot of things, including, I mean, the decline started with the arrival of television news, but obviously has accelerated a lot with the arrival of the internet. I look also at an industry which, I quoted the trust figures, an industry which is burning trust and which, in the transition to being purely online providers, is destroying the credibility of its own brands for the future. They are fake news brands in many cases now, rather than reliable, trustworthy journalism brands. So, as somebody who teaches journalism and encourages young people to get involved in journalism, and who loves it, I'm dismayed to see these historic brands squandering their most precious asset, which is their reputation. And I'm campaigning to try and get them to change.
But they're dying on their feet.
Well,
The Herald is gone, despite being supported by the
well, I'll tell you what I tell. Do you think that it's not worth teaching people to be journalists? There are more journalists employed in this country than there ever have been.
Perhaps the print media is the wrong outlet for them.
Yeah. Well, print media is certainly dying. I said that fairly early on. I think, yeah.
Question to that, because why is the standard of investigative journalism in this country so poor? Why do we not have a Washington Post or a New York Times? I get a lot of my news now from CNN, and that's not just American news, it's English news, and they are passionate about politics, about getting the truth, getting facts out. When you try to start that sort of conversation with anybody in the public here, they just don't want to talk about politics. It's almost as though, we'll see what happens, we'll wait and see what comes. There doesn't seem to be a role for investigative journalism to encourage people to have a debate about these matters in the way that they do in America.
I agree, and rather like you, and I think there may be other people in the room, I'm now a subscriber to several foreign news suppliers where I wasn't a year ago. I think that's very sad. I think there is good investigative journalism in this country, but very little of it is coming out of national newspapers. Broadcasters are not bad, although there is less than there should be. But I mean, they'll all tell you and it's true, it's very expensive to do. And there are not if you look at the United States, they have kind of angel investors. Some of the big tech people have invested in newspapers or, news brands, put it that way, big news brands. Washington Post being a case in point. And these are people with billions in their pockets, and they're able to fund that kind of thing. We have not had that kind of angel investor here. What we've had instead are the people who prefer to invest in the dying model of intrusion and dishonesty, propaganda, and the rest. And they will tell you, we can't afford to invest in investigative journalism. No, I agree with you. It's in a sorry state. Yes.
Brian, I, like you, work for Kingston University, and I'm much passionate about our students. I'm also a journalist. Could I ask you what your personal hopes are for the journalism students who are graduating this summer?
A good question. I think it's been a great year to teach journalism. More than any other year, it was possible to kind of light the blue touch paper in a seminar and just let them get on with it. It was just, and it was really exciting. And we ended up with some of the best work I've ever marked. So it's been a great year. So we have extremely high employment rates among our graduates in journalism. And what do I hope for them? I mean, I kind of like them to be as lucky as I was. I went into Reuters, but there are others. You know, Reuters has virtually disappeared now. I went into Reuters, which was a very ethical environment, very fast-moving. I get rather tired of people telling me how fast-moving news is now. You could get a white letter in your pigeonhole at Reuters in 1978 for being a minute late with a story. Every minute, we were told, was a deadline for one of our subscribers somewhere around the world, and we could not be later than our rivals with stories. And you got in trouble. But we were taught, you know, you still had to be accurate, you still had to be ethical. So I think if they could find employers who had those kind of standards, I mean, this is ideal if they could find employers, and you know, some of them do. That would be a great start for them. But most of all, I've been teaching ethics. And most of all, what you say to them is, you know, try to define your own standards and try to be true to them. Do not be led by the kind of corrosive erosion of standards that is, you know, operates in some of the newsrooms I've been describing. If you're in that kind of environment, get out. I tell them also, join the NUJ.
Thank you very much, Brian. We have gone over time, which is absolutely fine. I mean, Brian goes up and down the country and he gets this response all the time. He's very used to engaging with audiences long into the wee small hours on these topics, but we'll give him a rest now. We also need to vacate the building at some point. Thank you all very much for coming this evening to this talk in particular and to Kingston University. If you have any questions for Brian, I'm sure he's happy to talk to people afterwards, and if you've got any questions for anyone in the university, please feel free to stop one of us and have a chat. But for this particular session, I'd like to thank Professor Brian Cathcart.
Can I just say one word? No, one more word. I do not want to leave people pessimistic about this. I am an optimist. I'm absolutely convinced that journalism is indispensable in our society, and that good journalism, the laws of gravity, will take us back to hard facts. That's where we will end up, but we need to get there. Thank you very much.